Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Well, the war in Ukraine has been going on for 9 months now, and as we head towards winter, when presumably cold weather will force a halt or at least a reduction in the fighting, we are asking ourselves who's winning and who's losing, and who or what is likely to be the key factor deciding the outcome of this war. Well, we know from the great Prussian military theorist Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And Clausewitz famously spoke of the center of gravity, the key factor driving events, which of course can shift from one side to the other as the war continues. Napoleon also said that in war, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. What both meant, of course, was that it's not just a question of the determination of individual political leaders. It's also a reflection of the resilience of civilizations, the resilience of societies, the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of different organizational cultures. All of these things come into play. So how does this all apply to the current Ukraine conflict? Well, it means to me, at least, that there are 4 things that we need to look at. Factor 1, of course, is the unity and the resilience of the Ukrainian population. Factor number 2 is the Western support to Ukraine. Factor number 3 is the home front in Russia and whether it will continue to support Putin or increasingly fragment as opposition to the war grows. And factor 4 is Putin's obvious strategy of reckless escalation to regain the initiative and by escalation persuading us to back down and to compromise for fear of catastrophic consequences. So how do these factors play out? Well, first of all, the Ukrainians' unity. Here, clearly, Russia has made a mistake in underestimating the resilience of Ukrainian society, overplaying what Moscow thought were divisions between Russian speakers in the east and Ukrainian speakers in the west, underestimating the ability of the actor, President Zelensky, to grow into an inspirational war leader. In Ukraine, of course, no mass mobilization is required for the Ukrainians to replace the losses in their army. They have plenty of volunteers, and Russian atrocities, for example, the massacre of civilians, or in this week, the reports of the torture of Ukrainian prisoners of war, is only making Ukraine even more determined to continue the fight. And of course, as the Ukrainians have more successes, not only is the resistance coming from the Russian side, but the obvious self-belief and self-confidence of the Ukrainians themselves. Factor number 2 is Western support. Like many people, I would have thought that after 9 months, Western solidarity would begin to fracture, particularly, of course, the economic sacrifices, the higher inflation, the higher gas bills, as Russia has increased the energy pressure on Europe, war weariness, the sense that there has to be a compromise at the end of the day, or the unwillingness of the United States or Europe to continue to spend billions of euros and dollars buying weapons to give to the Ukrainians. But of course, the Ukrainian success on the battlefield makes it much harder now for Europeans to break ranks with the United States on this issue. Europe also has had a surprising degree of solidarity in replacing its dependence on Russian energy supplies. They were at 40 to 50%. They're now down in Italy or Germany to around 12%, filling the gas storage tanks from suppliers elsewhere. This winter will be tough, but if Europe can get through it, next spring, the situation in terms of being able to stand up to Russia economically is going to look massively better. Factor number 3 has been the fragmenting of Russian society as the costs of the war, the casualties on the Russian side, which are estimated to be at least in the region of 30,000 war dead thus far, strike home. Criticism of Putin and his tactics is now even coming from the right-wing Russian nationalist leader. More Russian generals are being fired for incompetence. For example, the commanders of the Western Military District and of the Russian Logistics Command in recent days. We're seeing small-scale but more widespread anti-war demonstrations, and so on. And 300,000 Russian young men have left the country rather than face conscription. And that's more Russian men than have been fighting in Ukraine thus far. Of course, in a totalitarian society like Russia, it's not clear just how far this sort of societal resistance is going to grow, but it's at least something to watch out for. And it certainly shows a much more fragmented Russia than just 1 month ago. And then finally, there's Putin's will to up the ante. The alleged sabotage of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, for instance, the forced annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces in recent days. And of course, the nuclear threat, the threat to break the Hiroshima taboo against the use of nuclear weapons and detonate as a demonstration shot a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. This, to my mind, makes no military sense. A tactical nuclear weapon would contaminate as many Russians as Ukrainians. It would further isolate Russia vis-a-vis China or India in the international community. It's not going to break the Ukrainian military resistance. In fact, it will probably produce retaliation beyond more sanctions against Russia itself by many Western countries and the United States. And Putin would then have to use more nuclear weapons if he wanted to escalate further, which would clearly put him in a very difficult position. But nonetheless, the nuclear threat has to be taken seriously. And one of the key things that we have to do in the next few days is send clear warnings to Moscow as to what the consequences would be. But Putin certainly wants to give us the impression that he's a kind of madman, to use Richard Nixon's famous theory, who is willing to go to any length to not to give in and not to lose face in a war which he started. So what should Western strategy be given these 4 factors over the next few days? Well, number one, remember the famous poster of World War II. Keep calm and carry on. The strategy is working. This is not the time to abandon it. Number 2, help the Ukrainians to gain the city of Kherson on the Black Sea before the winter pulls. This would put them in a military advantageous position and force Moscow at least to rethink its strategy over the winter months. It would make further Russian advances towards Odessa and conquest of Ukrainian territory all but impossible. Number 3, get through that energy winter, as I mentioned, in the EU, which means preserve EU unity as we go forward in sharing the economic burden, in sharing supplies, in building pipeline interconnectors to create a much more integrated European grid, and in capping the price that the EU is willing to pay for Russian gas. And finally, face down Putin's nuclear threats by making it clear that the consequences for Russia would be even more horrendous than the consequences for Ukraine or the West. So, as Margaret Thatcher famously said to George H.W. Bush in Aspen, Colorado, at the outbreak of the Gulf War in 1990, she said, "George, this is no time to go wobbly." And faced now with the evolution of the Ukrainian war, and finally that center of gravity swinging away from Moscow towards Kiev and the West, this is no time for us to go wobbly either. Thank you for watching and listening today. Look forward to seeing you again next week.